What is going on, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. Today, we are diving into one of the most important books ever written about modern warfare. A book that completely dismantled decades of military doctrine and forced generals and politicians to rethink everything they thought they knew about air power. We are talking about Professor Robert A. Pape's masterpiece, Bombing to Win: Air Power and Coercion in War. This isn't just a history book. It's a brutal, evidence-driven autopsy of one of the most persistent myths in military strategy. The idea that you can win a war from the sky. Pape looks at over 30 major air campaigns spanning nearly a century, from World War II all the way to the Gulf War, and he asks a question that makes Air Force generals very uncomfortable. Does bombing actually work? And more importantly, under what conditions does it work? Trust me, by the end of this breakdown, you are never going to look at news footage of airstrikes the same way again. Let's start with the big myth that Pape sets out to destroy. For decades, the dominant theory of strategic bombing was rooted in a simple, almost seductive idea. If you bomb a country's cities, factories, and civilian population hard enough, the people will eventually crack. They will turn on their leaders, lose their will to fight, and beg for peace. This is what Pape calls the punishment strategy. It sounds logical: inflict enough pain, and the enemy submits. The problem? History shows it almost never works that way. Pape's research demonstrates that when a state is fighting for its survival or for vital interests like territorial integrity, bombing civilians doesn't break their morale. It actually strengthens their resolve. Instead of turning against their government, the population rallies around the flag. They get angry, determined, and more willing to endure sacrifice. The entire foundation of strategic bombing doctrine was built on a fundamental misunderstanding of human psychology. But Pape doesn't just tell us what doesn't work. He gives us a comprehensive framework for understanding how air power can actually coerce an enemy. He breaks coercive air power down into 4 distinct mechanisms: punishment, risk, denial, and decapitation. Punishment is about breaking the enemy's will by destroying their economy and killing their people. Risk is about threatening to escalate the conflict in ways that make the enemy fear future catastrophic costs. Denial is about making it physically impossible for the enemy to achieve their military objectives on the ground. And decapitation is about targeting the enemy's leadership to paralyze their command structure. Pape systematically evaluates each mechanism across dozens of historical case studies, and his conclusions are devastating for traditional air power advocates. Punishment fails in the vast majority of cases, especially when the stakes are high and the enemy is fighting for regime survival or national independence. So if punishment doesn't work, what does? This is where Pape drops his bombshell argument. The only strategy that consistently produces results is what he calls denial. And pay close attention here, because this is the single most important takeaway from the entire book. Denial is not about breaking the enemy's will. It's about breaking their capability. The goal is to make the enemy's military strategy physically impossible to execute. You don't bomb cities to make the population suffer. You bomb supply depots, troop concentrations, bridges, fuel depots, and the logistics networks that keep the enemy army in the field. You target their tanks before they reach the front lines. You cut off their reinforcements and destroy their communication lines. The objective is to convince the enemy leadership that continuing to fight will only lead to decisive military defeat. Not because they lack the will, but because they lack the physical means to win. Now, let's ground this theory in historical reality, because that's where Pape's argument truly shines. One of the most compelling case studies in the book is the American bombing campaign in Vietnam, specifically Operation Rolling Thunder. This was a textbook example of a punishment strategy. The United States bombed North Vietnam relentlessly: industrial targets, infrastructure, and civilian areas, with the explicit goal of breaking Hanoi's will to continue supporting the Viet Cong insurgency. And what happened? Absolutely nothing. The bombing didn't break North Vietnamese morale. If anything, it hardened their determination. The leadership in Hanoi was fighting for national reunification and independence, a cause so deeply embedded in their identity that no amount of aerial destruction was going to make them quit. Pape argues that Rolling Thunder failed precisely because it was a punishment campaign targeting the wrong thing. All those bombs, sorties, and destruction were strategically pointless. It cost thousands of lives and billions of dollars and achieved exactly nothing. Contrast that disaster with the 1991 Gulf War, and you see Pape's theory come to life in brilliant clarity. Operation Desert Storm was fundamentally a denial campaign. The coalition didn't just bomb Baghdad for the sake of punishment. They executed a meticulously planned air campaign designed to systematically dismantle the Iraqi army's ability to fight. They targeted the Republican Guard, destroyed Iraqi supply lines, hit fuel depots and ammunition dumps, and bombed bridges and roads to isolate Iraqi forces in Kuwait from their supply bases in the north. When the ground war finally began, the Iraqi army was already combat ineffective. Cut off, starved of supplies, and psychologically broken not by terror, but by the realization that they had no chance of winning. The ground war lasted 100 hours. Pape's reconstruction of this campaign, drawing on declassified documents, shows exactly how denial leads to swift, decisive victory. But here is where the book gets really interesting and controversial. Pape doesn't just study conventional wars, he also applies his framework to nuclear deterrence and the threat of escalation. He argues that the risk strategy, threatening to escalate a conflict in ways that might lead to nuclear war, can work but only under very specific conditions. The classic example is the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the United States used the threat of further escalation to force the Soviet Union to remove its missiles from Cuba. Pape argues that risk works because it creates uncertainty and fear of catastrophic consequences, but it's extremely dangerous because it relies on brinkmanship. You are gambling with the fate of the world. The problem with risk is that it only works if the enemy believes you are irrational enough to actually follow through. If they call your bluff, you either escalate or back down and lose credibility. Now, let's talk about decapitation, the fourth mechanism in Pape's framework. Decapitation is the strategy of targeting the enemy's leadership, command infrastructure, and communication networks to paralyze their ability to direct the war. On the surface, it sounds like a surgical, efficient way to win. You take out the head and the body dies. But Pape's analysis is deeply skeptical of decapitation as a reliable strategy. Why? Because history shows that leadership decapitation rarely works as intended. Leaders are notoriously difficult to kill. They have bunkers, decoys, and redundant command structures. And even if you do eliminate the top leadership, there is usually a succession plan in place, and the new leaders often fight just as hard, sometimes harder, to prove their resolve. Pape points to examples like the Allied attempts to assassinate Hitler or Israeli strikes on Hamas leadership, where decapitation didn't end conflicts but simply prolonged them. Pape's work also has profound implications for the way we think about insurgency and counterinsurgency warfare. He argues that air power is almost completely ineffective against guerrilla movements and insurgencies. Why? Because insurgents don't have conventional military forces that you can target and destroy. They don't hold territory. They don't have supply lines in the traditional sense. They blend in with the civilian population. And they are fighting for ideological or nationalistic causes that are impervious to punishment. You can bomb a village to rubble, but you cannot bomb an idea out of existence. Pape's analysis shows that every attempt to use air power against insurgencies, whether it was the United States in Vietnam, the French in Algeria, or the Israelis in Lebanon, ended in failure. The only way to defeat an insurgency is through ground forces that can separate insurgents from the population, and air power cannot shortcut that slow, grueling process. Now, let's address the critics because Pape's book is not without its controversies. Some military historians have argued that Pape overstates his case and that punishment strategies have succeeded in some instances. They point to the bombing of Japan in 1945, where the firebombing of Tokyo and the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki arguably forced a surrender. But Pape pushes back hard on that interpretation. He argues that Japan's surrender was not caused by punishment but by a combination of denial and risk. The U.S. Navy's submarine campaign had already destroyed Japan's merchant fleet, cutting off its supply of oil and raw materials. The Soviet Union's entry into the war destroyed any hope of a negotiated settlement. And the atomic bombs demonstrated a new risk, the threat of total annihilation. It was denial of Japan's ability to continue the war, combined with the risk of further nuclear strikes, that forced the surrender. So what are the practical takeaways from bombing to win? First, if you are a policymaker or military planner, you need to abandon the fantasy that air power is a cheap, bloodless solution to complex geopolitical problems. Bombing is not a substitute for strategy. It is a tool that must be wielded with precision and purpose. Second, you need to ask a fundamental question before ordering any airstrike. Are we trying to punish the enemy, or are we trying to deny their victory? If you are pursuing punishment, history suggests you are almost certainly going to fail. If you are pursuing denial, you need intelligence, precision, patience, and crucially, ground forces to exploit the opportunities air power creates. Air power creates the conditions for victory. It does not deliver victory on its own. And third, be honest about air power's limitations against non-state actors. No amount of precision bombing defeats an ideology that requires political and social solutions beyond the military domain. So what do you think? Is Pape right about denial being the only viable coercive strategy? Or do you think there are cases where punishment or decapitation have actually worked? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below because I want to hear your take. If you found this breakdown valuable, smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next deep dive into the strategy books that actually explain the world. We have got more classic military theory coming your way, so stay tuned. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.